There's a smell that lives in old barns, the kind you can't find in a candle shop or a spray bottle, no matter how hard some company tries to bottle nostalgia and sell it to you for $12 a jar. It's a mixture of dried hay dust, 50 years of pigeon business in the rafters, cold concrete, and somewhere underneath all of that, so faint you almost convince yourself you imagined it, the ghost of diesel fuel. That's the smell that hit me the moment I pulled back the plywood sheet my grandfather had nailed over the old stall door sometime around the Nixon administration. I didn't know what I was looking for that day. I only knew my grandmother had asked me, in that quiet voice old women use when they're handing you something heavier than they're letting on, to see what your grandpa left back there. She wouldn't say more than that. She just handed me a crowbar and walked back toward the house like she didn't want to watch. That farm sits on soil that's been turned by 4 generations of the same family. Black dirt so rich it practically hums when you dig into it. The kind of ground that farmers 2 states over would trade a barn full of equipment for. My great-grandfather cleared that land with a team of horses and a stubbornness that apparently runs in the blood. My grandfather grew up walking behind a plow before he ever sat on a tractor seat, and by the time this particular John Deere rolled onto the property, it wasn't just a machine to him. It was the next chapter in a relationship between a family and a piece of earth that went back further than anyone left alive could properly account for. You don't bury a chapter like that behind plywood without a reason. You bury it because something in that chapter hurt too much to keep reading. I want you to understand something about my grandfather before I tell you what was behind that plywood, because the man matters just as much as the machine. He was not a sentimental man. He did not keep love letters. He did not keep photographs, except the ones my grandmother forced into frames and hung against his will. He was a man who fixed things because things needed fixing, and then he moved on to the next thing that needed fixing, and he did this for 61 years without once, as far as any of us knew, holding on to a single piece of broken machinery out of nostalgia. So when I pried that plywood loose and found a tractor buried under 4 decades of straw canvas and what I can only describe as deliberate, careful neglect, I knew immediately that this wasn't a man forgetting something in a corner. This was a man hiding something, and there is a very particular kind of goosebumps that comes from realizing the person you loved most in the world had a secret, and it's sitting right in front of you, rusting. The tractor was a John Deere, and even under the dust and the pigeon droppings and the rat's nest someone had built inside the seat cushion, I could tell it was old enough to have a personality instead of a model number that meant anything to me. The green paint had gone the color of a forest after a fire, that dull, ashy shade that used to be vibrant and now just looks tired. The yellow on the wheels had faded to the color of an old bruise, and there was rust. God, there was rust in places. Rust has no business being. Rust that had eaten through sheet metal like the years themselves had teeth. I ran my hand along the hood, and it came away orange and flaking, little curls of oxidized steel sticking to my palm like dead leaves. I stood there in that dim barn light, dust floating in the one beam of sun coming through a gap in the boards, and I felt something I can only describe as being watched, not by anything living. By the machine itself, like it had been waiting. Here's the thing about restoring old iron that nobody tells you until you've done it for a while. A tractor talks to you before you ever turn a key. It talks to you in the position it was left in. It talks to you in what's missing and what's still there. And this one was screaming something at me if I'd known how to listen yet. The seat was down like someone had just climbed off. The choke was pulled halfway and wedged into the toolbox on the side. Wrapped in a shop rag gone stiff as cardboard was a bolt, just one bolt, 6 inches long, hand-cut threads, the kind of bolt you don't buy at a store, the kind a blacksmith makes for you, because nothing off the shelf will do. I held that bolt in my hand for a long time before I understood I was holding the reason the whole tractor had been buried alive. I need to back up because you deserve to know why a woman spends her weekends elbow-deep in 60-year-old grease, instead of doing whatever it is people assume a woman my age should be doing. I didn't grow up wanting to fix tractors. I grew up watching my grandfather fix tractors, which is a different thing entirely, and a more dangerous one, because watching plants a seed that takes decades to sprout, and by the time it does, you're too old for anyone to talk you out of it. I remember being maybe 8 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket in that same barn, watching him work on a baler that had eaten a chain and refused to apologize for it. He didn't explain what he was doing. He never explained anything. He just worked, and every once in a while he'd grunt out a word, clevis, PTO, shear pin, like he was teaching me a language one syllable at a time, on his own schedule. Whether I was ready or not, I didn't know I was being taught. I thought I was just being tolerated. It took me until I was well into my 50s, after he was gone, to understand that every silent afternoon in that barn was the only kind of love letter that man knew how to write. So, when I found that tractor, buried and abandoned in a way that violated everything I knew about him, I didn't call a restoration shop. I didn't post it for sale to some collector 3 states away who'd strip it for parts and forget where it came from. I rolled up my sleeves and I went to work, 'cause some things you don't hire out, some things you owe. The first fight was getting her out of the stall at all. 4 decades of settling had let the front tires sink into the dirt floor until they were half buried, like the earth itself had decided to keep her. I jacked up what I could, packed gravel under the rims, and spent 3 straight evenings just convincing that machine she was allowed to move again. There's a particular kind of stubbornness in a tractor that's been still that long. It's not mechanical, not really. It's something closer to grief. She didn't want to be disturbed. And I understood that because I'd buried things too, things I didn't want disturbed either. And there's a strange kinship that grows between a woman and a machine when you realize you're both objects that got left in a corner and told to be quiet. Once she was rolled out into daylight for the first time in 40 years, the real archaeology began. I want to tell you about the engine block first, because that's where the mystery started to unravel, slow as a knot pulled loose one strand at a time. I pulled the side panels, expecting corrosion, expecting seized pistons, expecting the kind of catastrophic internal rust that turns a rebuild into a headstone instead of a resurrection. What I found instead was oil. Old oil, thick as molasses, gone black and tarry with age, but oil. Someone had drained the crankcase and refilled it with enough preservative oil to protect that engine for decades before sealing it up and walking away. That's not neglect. Nobody neglects a machine that carefully. That's a man saying goodbye and making sure whatever came next wouldn't hurt her. I sat on an overturned bucket, the same kind I'd sat on as a girl, maybe even the same bucket. Who knows how long things last in a barn like that? And I just stared at that engine for a long while. Because a man who cares enough to preserve an engine before hiding it away is a man who intended for someone to find it. He wasn't discarding this tractor. He was leaving it in a time capsule. And the question that had been humming quietly in the back of my skull since I first pulled that plywood loose got louder. Why? Why bury something you loved instead of just parking it out back like every other retired tractor on every other farm in the county? Farmers don't hide their old iron. They let it die in the open, in a fence row, in a field, dignified and visible, a monument to work done. Hiding it was different. Hiding it meant something happened. The transmission told me the next piece of the story, though it took me 2 weeks of soaking rusted bolts in penetrating oil to get there. Old iron doesn't give up its secrets easily, and there's a kind of prayer you learn to say over a stuck bolt, a patience that has nothing to do with faith and everything to do with knowing that force without understanding just breaks things. My grandfather taught me that too, without ever saying it directly. Let the oil do the work, that he'd say, and walk away and come back an hour later, and the bolt that wouldn't move for me would turn for him like it had been waiting for permission. I've spent my whole life since then learning to be the kind of person a bolt trusts enough to turn for. When I finally got the transmission housing open, I found a gear that had been shattered. Not worn, not gradually failed, but shattered, the way metal breaks when it's asked to do something violent and sudden. There were teeth missing entirely, flung off somewhere into the housing, ground to metal dust by whatever kept turning after the gear gave out. That's not a mechanical failure you walk away from with a shrug. That's the kind of failure that happens in a moment, loud and sudden, the kind of failure a man remembers exactly where he was standing when it happened. I ran my thumb along the broken teeth, feeling the sharp edges that 4 decades hadn't managed to dull, and I understood I was looking at the exact instant this machine had gone quiet. Something had happened right here, right in this gear, and whatever it was, it had been bad enough to make a man who never gave up on machinery give up on this one, at least for a while. I called my grandmother that night. I asked her, as gently as I know how to ask anything, if she remembered the tractor going down. There was a silence on the phone long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then she told me, in that same quiet voice from the barn, that she remembered the day, but not the way I expected. She said it wasn't the tractor that broke that day. She said something else happened, and the tractor just happened to be what he was sitting on when it did. I'm not going to tell you what she told me next. Not yet, because I think you need to sit with that gear a little longer, the way I had to. I think you need to understand that sometimes the machine isn't the story. Sometimes the machine is just the last thing a person was holding on to when the real story happened, and fixing it becomes the only way left to hold on to them. What I can tell you is that the bolt in the toolbox, that hand-forged 6-inch bolt wrapped in a rag stiff as cardboard, didn't belong to this tractor at all. I spent an entire Saturday matching it against every fastener on that frame, every mounting point, every possible thread pattern, and it fit nowhere. It was a bolt with no home, kept for a reason that had nothing to do with mechanics. My grandfather was not a man who kept things without purpose. If that bolt meant nothing, it would have been sold for scrap decades before I was born. Instead, it had been wrapped like something fragile and tucked away like something precious, sitting 6 inches from a shattered gear in an engine that had been carefully, deliberately, lovingly put to sleep. I started the restoration in earnest after that because I needed my hands busy while my mind worked on the rest of it. I pulled the radiator first and found it packed solid with the kind of orange mineral scale that builds up over generations of hard well water, decades of it compressed into something closer to stone than sediment. Cleaning it meant hours with a wire brush and a solution strong enough to make my eyes water. Working in a barn with the doors open and a fan blowing the fumes toward the tree line, because some jobs you just have to do the old way. Patience over convenience, elbow grease over shortcuts. That's the whole philosophy of this kind of work. Really. You don't throw money at a problem until it goes away. You throw time at it and an understanding and a stubbornness that matches the machine's stubbornness until eventually one of you gives in. And it's never the machine that gives in first, if you're doing it right. The tires were beyond saving, cracked and dry-rotted into something closer to petrified wood than rubber. And I'll admit, that's the one place I spent real money, because there's no amount of patience that brings a tire back from 40 years of sitting under its own weight. But everything else, the fuel lines, the wiring, the gaskets I could source or fabricate myself, I did with what I had, what I could scrounge, what I could barter for at swap meets with old men who looked at me sideways until they realized I knew exactly what I was asking for. There's a particular satisfaction in a woman my age walking into a room full of men half convinced she doesn't belong there, and walking out 20 minutes later, having taught 3 of them something about ignition timing they didn't know. I've earned every one of those rooms. I've earned every callus on these hands. My grandfather would tell you, calluses are just proof you showed up. There's a texture to old John Deere paint that you only understand once you've spent enough hours with your fingertips against it. Fresh, it would have been glossy enough to catch the noon sun and throw it back at you. 40 years on, it had gone chalky and thin in places, flaking away from the steel in curls no bigger than a fingernail, revealing gray primer underneath like scar tissue showing through skin that's been too many places. I spent whole evenings just running a soft brush across those panels, not restoring anything yet, just learning the shape of the damage, the way a nurse might read a patient's chart before ever touching a wound. Some patches of paint had survived almost perfectly, protected by whatever had leaned against them in storage. And the contrast between those bright green islands and the rust-eaten valleys around them told its own quiet story about which parts of this machine had been shielded and which parts had simply been left exposed to time. The engine itself came apart clean once I got into it, better than I had any right to expect, given how long it had sat. That preservative oil had done its job. The cylinder walls still held a faint sheen where they should have been pitted with rust, and when I finally worked the pistons free, they came with the kind of resistance that tells you a machine wants to run again, not the dead resistance of something seized beyond hope. I replaced the rings, lapped the valves by hand the way my grandfather taught me, feeling for that particular grind that tells you the seat is true, no gauge required, just fingertips and patience, and 40 years of watching him do it before I ever tried it myself. Every gasket I set slow. Every bolt I torqued in sequence, the way it's supposed to be done, the way that separates a rebuild that lasts 20 years from one that fails in 20 minutes. But I kept coming back to that broken gear and that homeless bolt and my grandmother's silence on the phone. Some nights I'd stand in that barn after dark, just the shop light humming over the tractor's skeleton, and I'd talk to it a little, which I know sounds foolish coming from a practical woman, but I don't think it's foolish at all. I think a machine that's been loved that hard holds something in it, some residue of the hands that built it and the hands that broke it and the hands, finally, that are putting it back together. I think if you listen close enough in a quiet barn, a tractor will tell you what it's been holding on to. My grandmother finally told me the rest of it on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. And she told it to me the way she tells everything hard, plainly, without drama, like the facts alone were enough weight to carry. She told me that on the day the gear shattered, my grandfather wasn't alone on that tractor. She told me who was riding with him, and why, and what happened in the field that afternoon, that had nothing to do with metal fatigue or mechanical failure, and everything to do with the kind of accident that reorders a family's whole shape in about 4 seconds. She told me why the bolt mattered, what it had been meant to fix before everything changed, and why a man who fixed everything left that one thing broken on purpose, sealed away in a barn stall behind a sheet of plywood, for 40 years. Because some repairs you're not ready to make, and some machines you keep whole precisely by refusing to touch them. I'm not going to write that part out for you here. Plainly, in a paragraph, you can skim past on your way to the ending. It deserves better than that. What I'll tell you instead is what I did once I understood it. Once I sat with it long enough that the grief and the gratitude stopped fighting each other in my chest and settled into something quieter. I finished the tractor. I fixed the gear. I found a shop 3 counties over that could still cut a custom tooth pattern on an old machine, and I paid what it cost because some money is worth spending. And when it came time to reassemble that transmission housing, I took that hand-forged bolt, the one with no home anywhere on the frame, and I found a place for it. Not a mechanical place, a ceremonial one. I had it welded, quietly, permanently, to the underside of the seat bracket where no one would ever see it unless they went looking. Exactly the way I'd gone looking, exactly the way my grandfather had left it for someone, someday, to find. The morning I turned the key for the first time in 40 years, my hands were not steady, and I'm not a woman who admits to unsteady hands easily. I'd primed the fuel system the night before, checked the compression, checked it twice more because checking things twice is cheaper than breaking something a 3rd time. I climbed up into that worn seat, the same seat where a man I loved had once sat and had the worst afternoon of his life. And I said something out loud to him, something I won't repeat here either, because some words are just for the barn and the machine and the person saying them. And then I turned the key. She didn't catch right away. Old diesels rarely do, not after that long, not without a fight, and I sat there pumping the throttle, listening to the starter grind against compression, 40 years of stubbornness pushing back against me the same way it had pushed back against every rusted bolt on that frame. And then, on the 4th try, she caught. Not smooth. Not immediately. She coughed a cloud of blue-white smoke that hung in the barn doorway like a held breath finally let go, and the whole engine shuddered like something waking up from a very long, very deep sleep. And then she settled into a rhythm, that low diesel heartbeat, uneven at first and then steadier, steadier, until it filled that barn the way it must have filled it decades before I was even born. I sat there and cried, which I am not embarrassed to tell you, because there is no shame in crying over an engine that just told you, in the only language it knows, that some things you bury don't stay buried if you love them enough to dig them back up. My grandmother came out to the barn when she heard it run. She stood in the doorway for a long time just listening, and she didn't say anything, and neither did I, and we didn't need to. The tractor was saying it for both of us. I still drive her sometimes, slow loops around the back pasture on quiet afternoons. And every time that engine catches, I think about a man who could fix anything except the one thing that broke him, and how he found a way to keep it safe anyway, sealed behind plywood, preserved in oil, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough and willing enough to open it back up. That's the thing nobody tells you about old iron. It isn't really about the metal at all. It's about what people trust a machine to hold on to for them when they can't hold on to it themselves. And if you're patient, if you're careful, if you let the oil do the work and you don't force a bolt that isn't ready to turn, sometimes a machine will hand that trust right back to you 40 years later, running steady, telling the whole story out loud in a language only the people who've listened long enough ever learn to understand.